Welcome very much to Conversations. I'm pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Niles Eldredge. And Dr. Eldredge is I'm going to let him explain. He's a curator of invertebrates at the American Museum of Natural History, and he's written an extremely interesting book that I want to show right at the outset, and we're going to talk about. Maybe we can show it. It's called Dominion, and it's subtitled Can Nature and Culture Coexist? And it's a great pleasure to welcome him to Conversations and to Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
Thanks,
Dr.
Harold.
Eldredge.
Nice to be here.
I wonder if you might. You wrote, if I understand from reading the book, you and Stephen Jay Gould had become part of, had developed this punctuated equilibrium theory of evolution. But you've been involved in the studies of evolution and the exciting developments that have been going on in terms of our understanding of that. Maybe you could share a little bit, if you would, your own background. You've been at the American Museum for quite a while.
I've been at the American Museum since 1969, and
right.
I was actually a student at Columbia prior to that, and we all did our apprenticeship down at the museum, Steve and I, and a number of other good paleontologist students in the 1960s. All of us interested in evolution, all of us interested in going out and seeing at the invertebrate fossil record. These are backboneless organisms that make very common fossils. They're the rich, dense fossil record, and we thought the time was right for people to go out and examine the nature of the fossil record and to see what it tells us about the nature of the evolutionary process. So I've been spending my entire career trying to basically compare the facts of history on the one hand with what we have learned from geneticists and other forms of evolutionary biologists, what they have to say about the nature of the evolutionary process, and see if we can't put the facts of history, make them resonate a little bit better with what we're saying about how the evolutionary process works, sort of try to bring them closer together. The notion of punctuated equilibria was one sort of signal example of that work. Yeah,
it's been an incredible, like so many things in science, it's been an incredibly exciting time, this century, let's say, the developments. But, I mean, our understanding of evolution, I mean, since Darwin and from other, 19th century examples and understandings and so forth, but the evolution of our understanding and the developments, as you integrate genetic examples, the work of Louis Leakey and other things, it must have been an incredibly exciting time as more and more of the picture begins to get clearer.
Exactly.
As difficult as it is to discern in absolute terms, but it's getting clearer all the time and more interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, part of my work has been on the actual facts of evolutionary history. You mentioned Louis Leakey. Louis Leakey was, of course, really a pivotal figure in zeroing in on the actual history of human evolution. The other side of the coin, though, is how does the evolutionary process work? And usually the division of labor still is seen to be, it's the geneticists on one side who have a lot to tell us about how natural selection works. It's all very good work, and the role of mutations and so forth, and population size. And we paleontologists are usually relegated to doing what you're thinking about with Louis Leakey, which is to simply document the fact of evolution and the precise course of evolution. But the more interesting thing to my mind is not just the facts of evolution and not just what the geneticists can tell us about natural selection and so forth, but trying to put those two things together to yield a really dynamic view of what the evolutionary process is all about.
Understanding the whole process.
Yeah, exactly. And making the process, the theories, the statements about the process be responsible to the actual facts of history as far as we can determine them. And also to be careful that our interpretations of history are consonant with what we know about the biology of the situation, which in terms of human evolution, we might even get into this. I get into it in my book, Dominion.
Absolutely.
Some interpretations of human evolution just don't make any biological sense, and so forth.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you say history and paleontology, you're going back pre-history.
Sure.
So maybe it might be good. Maybe just for the people who are viewing and people aren't following it. What are we talking? We're talking about, we know now we're the third planet in this solar system. It's evolved, and life begins 3.5 billion, 4 billion years. 3.5 billion. Maybe you could bring us up to date.
The Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Which is quite incredible.
Yes.
Oldest rocks that we know about are about 4 billion years old now. But there was a Scottish farmer, James Hutton, 200 years ago, realized that because of the processes of erosion and metamorphism and so forth, just the normal processes of history, is quite unlikely you're going to find anything that goes back to the very, very beginning. So it's actually quite wonderful that we found in the cores of continents rocks that are about 4 billion years old. Those are granites and so forth. One very exciting aspect about this early history, though, is as soon as you get rocks that are formed from the grains of sediment so the streams are washing down, you get erosion of the granites and so forth, and so you get sand being carried, and they collect in ponds and in
sedimentary.
So it's the sedimentary basins, yeah.
Yes.
And that's the kind of place where you look for the inclusion, the burial, basically, of living things in these muds that accumulate, and those turn over the course of eons into stone, into rock.
Right.
That's the kind of rock that you can't look for granite for fossils, because it's igneous. It cools from a molten mass. So you have to look at sedimentary rocks. As soon as you get the earliest sedimentary rocks, and I guess the oldest ones I know of are in northern Australia, about 3.7, I guess, billion years old, you get fossils in there.
Then you can, when you get that. Yeah.
So fossils are really intrinsic to the Earth. I mean, so life is intrinsic to the Earth.
So we can say 3.5 billion years ago that the first life forms, or early life forms, a precursor to our complicated life forms. Now, and if we back up a little bit more than that, just to start at the very beginning, the universe itself. What do we got a date on that? When Big Bang?
There's been some controversy about that recently. A couple of years ago, I could have said with some confidence 15 billion was...
Yeah, that's what I would have thought. Yeah.
But there's now some sort of anomalies, which I'm not even prepared to... I don't understand.
Yeah. Yes, right, I understand.
I understand the universe we live in. Yeah, exactly. There's some data that suggests to some astronomers, I believe, that the Earth is a little bit younger than that, maybe 11 billion. But I don't know what the status of that particular...
And then going through the process so we can begin to see the first beginnings of, whatever it was that led into life around 3.5 billion years ago. In
the thing is, all we can say is the earliest rocks that you might find fossils, and you do. So you don't know what that's a minimum age for the origin of life.
And do we have a very good idea, and we don't want to go in detail on it, the very good idea of how that amazing process began?
Well, it's a resonance between proteins and these molecules, RNA and DNA, we think, I think rather overly simplistically, that these molecules, DNA and RNA, are the things that cause the formation of proteins, and then the proteins march off and they make up our bodies, and they are the enzymes that run our bodies and so forth. So it's like a one-way street. On the other hand, it was shown by Stanley Miller in 1953, running a very simple experiment at the University of Chicago. The protein chains, or sort of semi-proteins, they're not full functional proteins, but they're chains of amino acids, will form just spontaneously by passing a spark through a cloud chamber with, I guess, methane and a few other, in the absence of oxygen. You'll get these chains. And so it's always looked, or it's looked for the last 40 years, as though it's easier to form spontaneously proteins than these complex deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and RNA. So it's now been shown that there are mechanisms where you get this reverse transcription going on. I'm not sure where the theorists are right now. They're arguing whether the proteins came before, which are easier to form spontaneously than these macromolecules of heredity, or the more conventional view still is that those molecules were formed and then the proteins are a reflection of that, or whether it was some sort of a resonance between them and the primordial ooze. But again, I'm not an organic.
Yeah, that's right. That's another realm of speculation, another exciting story that can be told.
Yeah, it's terrific. And so forth, I'm not prepared to go on.
At the end of which we begin to pick up on the realm of the paleontologist.
Right, we do. And these are the physical remains of life. Right. And it's bacteria for what? For 3.5 billion years up to about 0.5 billion. It's about for 3 billion years. Nothing but bacteria. Some of the bacteria make these cabbagey-shaped mounds that you find in the rocks. And they're still being formed in Shark Bay, for instance, in northern Australia, and in a few other very shallow water tropical situations. You get these laminations of what are called blue-green algae, but they're really bacteria. And every day, sun comes up and they start multiplying like mad, and they form these mats, and they're photosynthesizing and dividing and so forth. And then sediment comes in, usually with a tide, and washes over, and it traps the sediment. So the next day, the cells come up, get above that ooze, and then start the whole process again. So you get these series of laminae, and you can find those going way back 2 billion years.
Really?
Yeah, macroscopic things. If you go out to Nevada and I guess southeastern California and our continent, you can see these algal stromatolite things that are quite old.
So we had a 3 billion year part where it was all...
The world was run by bacteria. The world is still run by bacteria.
It still is, isn't it? Right. Maybe it's good to understand that. Because one of the themes of your book is that while we like to think we're divorced from nature, we really are part of an organic whole, right?
You know, and of course,
the bacteria and viruses.
Our bodies
and
are
things.
ecosystems just loaded with bacteria, without which we couldn't live. So
Sure. But it was going over 3 billion years, as you say, until 500 million years ago, something like that.
Something happened.
That something happened.
Something happened, and you start picking up a proliferation of hard-shelled creatures, mostly animal creatures, some of which are very difficult to interpret, but some of them are very familiar to us, or they're sort of primitive versions of things that are very, very familiar to us. And it's called the Cambrian explosion. And literally, it took about 10 million years for this thing to really get in place, but that's a relatively brief span of time, given the 3 billion years of just bacteria. And so the question always is, what happened? What caused this proliferation of different kinds of things? And when I say different kinds of things, I mean arthropods. I work on trilobites.
Yes.
Many people who know fossils know what a trilobite is because they're complex and they look like, well, they're related to insects and crabs and shrimp and that kind of thing, and they have eyes, and they're very complex forms of life. They were there at the base of the Cambrian, various kinds of mollusks like clams and snails, not so much clams, but snails, and other kinds of primitive mollusks, echinoderms, modern examples being, I guess, sea urchins and so forth.
And they were there at the early Cambrian?
Yeah, not sea urchins per se, but again, members of that particular group. The skeletons are basically chemically and physically the same sort of a thing. So there was a real sort of a sudden diversification. My favorite explanation about what might have triggered that,
this Cambrian explosion,
is that it was a suggestion of a couple of geochemists maybe 30, 40 years ago now, that the rise in oxygen in the atmosphere reached a critical point so that there was enough dissolved oxygen in seawater to support more complex forms of life, multicellular life, even if they were rather small at first. And it might have risen only 1 to 2% of the current level of saturation of oxygen in seawater, but that was enough to support these more complex forms of life. If that's correct, or if it was something else that we can't quite detect what it was, nonetheless, the pattern looks like a real threshold. It looks like you get to a point, and then bingo, life can sort of take advantage of the situation. It's very much a matter of, if there's an opportunity, nature's going to rush in. There's certainly biological nature. It's the whole story of the history of life. It's going to rush in there and fill that vacuum and literally take advantage of the situation.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And it also says that all these biochemical models are there underneath the organic. I mean, it's a biochemical model trying to understand this whole organic whole that the Earth is. The story is just absolutely staggering. The whole story.
One important thing, I was just taking a test, as a matter of fact, in the review in the New York Times of this particular book, Dominion, for stressing the importance of the physical environment. But you've already seen, the example I gave you back 530 million years ago now, is of
the physical environment
doing something happening there that either in later instances snuffs out a tremendous amount of life, or in this instance makes the opportunity for life to proliferate. I come from a geological background, so does Steve Gould, so did a lot of my colleagues, but so did Charles Darwin, actually. His only major training was in geology.
What was his major contribution?
Charles Darwin.
Where was he? Where were we before him? Where were we after him in terms of understanding these things?
Even back to the Greeks, there was some sort of inklings of evolution, meaning simply that all the creatures on the face of the earth are descended from a single common ancestor. That's sort of a baseline definition of evolution. That notion was around. What did he give us? He was the one who convinced the Western thinking world that life, in fact, has had an evolutionary history, that was the whole purpose of writing The Origin of Species.
You said earlier, we had the belief that all human forms came from one common ancestor.
Not all human forms, all
life forms.
What I said was, I probably said it too quickly, was that there were, even the Greeks, some of the independent thinkers throughout the years have proposed that there's a relatedness to the creatures on the face of the earth. So in other words, that's the basic idea of evolution.
Right.
So Darwin wasn't the first to think of it. And in fact, there was a big tradition in France for about at least 100 years prior to Darwin of thinking in precisely those terms. But largely, but not solely, because of the basic Western cultural story about this, which was derived from Genesis, which was that supernatural being, God, created everything the way we see it. That was the sort of the fictional line. there was a resistance, I think, more telling resistance to accepting a notion of evolution, because there was no way that people could see the apparent stability of form. You know, there's a separateness to the species out there. And how do you actually take that and change from one species to another? Yeah. The mechanisms eluded people. Mm-hmm. Although Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus, actually sort of had an idea like natural selection himself.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, there were a few forerunners there. Uh-huh. What Darwin did was agonize over this stuff for half of a professional lifetime. He wrote in his autobiography that he well remembered the spot in the road where the whole idea, I think it was in 1838, where the idea of natural selection came to him. Mm-hmm. Put together the ideas of Thomas Malthus about the regulation of populations by natural phenomena like limitation of food and so forth, with the notion that all organisms tend to resemble their parents and that there is variation in nature. And he came up with this mechanism of natural selection. I mean, basically, the idea is that more organisms are born in each generation that can possibly survive and reproduce. Mm-hmm. And sort of the telling example of that would be, he uses an example of elephants, and I don't know if I can remember it exactly from the origin, but it goes something like this. Darwin said, I don't remember, or we don't know too much about the biology of breeding in elephants, but let us suppose that you start with one pair of fertile elephants and let them live to a ripe old age of 60 years, I guess, or a reproductive age of 60 years, and they start reproducing at the age of 10, and each couple produces one offspring elephant every decade, even, he said. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's 6 per couple, and he said if you let that clock run, in, I don't know, 5,000 years, you're going to have 19 million elephants, I think is what he said. Uh-huh. And so he said, and he actually used a phrase which I think is neat. He said, if you let that go much longer, and we know the Earth is a lot older than elephants have been around for a lot longer than 5,000 years. Yeah. If you let that go, the Earth is going to be standing room only. He actually used that phrase.
He did, right? In the scientific literature, right?
Yeah, in 1859.
SRO,
so
right?
SRO has been around for a long time.
Right, yeah.
And clearly the world is not standing room in elephants or anything else except for increasingly in people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The reasons for that, I think,
7 billion, yeah.
Yeah,
we're going to get to that.
We're going to get to that.
Yeah.
So there's something controlling the size of populations. And so what he's saying is, by analogy with the pigeon, the success of breeders of pigeons, he apprenticed himself to those people. But all the selective breeding things is nature in a sense is saying, okay, not everybody can survive and reproduce. That's just the luck of the draw. So it's those creatures that are best suited to meeting the needs of the physical environment that they're living in that are going to tend to survive, and they're going to leave more, what we would now say, leave more copies of their genes.
Yeah, and the changes that might occur through mutation would be one. There'd be a great deal of them would be disadvantaged, but some of them might be advantaged.
Yeah, well, the whole concept of mutation was. He didn't know about that.
Didn't know from Mendel?
Well, he had an uncut copy of Mendel's paper on his shelf. He never read it. So the beautiful thing about natural selection is that Darwin did not know why organisms resemble their parents, because it's a process that goes on inside populations. All he knew was that there is a process of heredity, sort of like a black box.
Well, that's it. We keep learning so much.
Oh, yeah.
Saying, how in the world can they put these things together in the past without knowledge of all the things that we have now?
Yeah, exactly.
But in any event, so we want to keep moving. You're a paleontologist, and this idea of the new species appearing and the origin of species that Darwin was precursor to, and the exciting story is that is this maybe it's a time for you to elaborate a little bit on this punctuated equilibrium that you and Stephen Gould came up with.
Right.
What is it? What is that?
I mean, to bring that up because it's an empirical observation, which is that once a new species shows up in the fossil record, you're out there driving around in your car, and upstate New York, where I was working, in rocks that are about 380 million years old, and there's a rich and fascinating fossil record up there. Fossils are very easy to come by. And as soon as you get to those...
Into Laurentian now? Or is
now we're just in the Mohawk Valley. We're just south of the Mohawk Valley along Route 20. Beautiful rolling cattle country.
Okay, right.
The Middle Devonian rocks, they run from basically Albany all the way over to to buffalo.
Okay, okay, yeah.
And it's a wonderful sort of laboratory of evolution.
Yeah, Laurentia would be
That's Precambrian,
it would be all right. It wouldn't
rocks. Wonderful place to go to.
Right, but not for fossils. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, because it's too old. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Now the thing is, if you go to these rocks, and these are a great case in point, and go to the lowest layers where this particular fauna is called the Hamilton fauna shows up. It's where Colgate University is. You find a nice array of different species there. And it's just like going to the beach on Long Island and walking along and seeing any kid will take a collection of shells out in Long Island and be able to segregate them into different species. It's not really very difficult. It's just kind of obvious. And if you do that in the fossil record of some horizon, it turns out that those individual groups that you identify are recognizable through a vast span of rock. Well, I guess it's about 700, 800 feet of rock in central New York, but it's actually 6 to 7 million years of time that you're looking at.
Right.
And you get the same creatures showing up.
Really?
Yeah. Woo. And they are recognizable. There's a famous one, it's a brachiopod. Brachiopods are like clams. They have two shells, but they're not quite, they're more primitive than clams. Doesn't really matter what they are, but there's a famous one called Mucrospirifer mucronatus. It's like the bald eagle of the Middle Devonian. You know, and everybody who goes out there knows what this thing is, and it's common as dirt. It literally is. And you find them down there near the bottom of this so-called Hamilton group of rocks, and you find them at the top, and you can't tell them apart.
Really?
And we've actually, my students and I and colleagues up at the University of Rochester are running a mammoth program on this now to look at as many of these different species as we can. And we're finding time after time that you get a little bit of sort of variation as you go through time, and there's a little bit of sort of evolutionary change or whatever it is. But by the time you get to the top, invariably, those species are still very much the same as they were at the
over
bottom.
that long haul.
6 million years, and
amazing.
That's stunning.
Now that's a long time for them to be
that's a heck of a long time.
Successful.
Right. And see, what happened was when I was doing my PhD at Columbia, and Steve was there, and Gould, and a number of other people, each of us took a little chunk of time and a little group of organisms to try to chase evolution up the rocks, basically, was what it was. And the presupposition we all started out with was that given that kind of time, in the inevitability that the environments would do some changing.
Indeed, of course.
As you go through that, natural selection would necessarily be driving these species in different evolutionary directions, and we could finally start documenting the
changes.
And particularly the kind of changes that Darwin said his whole theory would stand or fall on.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the dumbest thing that he ever said, because his theory is still very good, but he shouldn't have hinged it on this. He projected his syllogism was sort of if you see what's going on with breeders and you get over a few generations a little bit of change in a particular desired direction, then if you have millions of years at your disposal, then nature is going to run these things and run that clock and just keep running it in one way. So it's inevitable that you're going to get this sort of gradual progression through time.
Yeah,
and
some changes in there.
Right. So the belief was that the fossil record is good and dense enough, you're going to get this gradual progression going on.
Yeah. And you found the similarity of 500 million years.
We found virtual stability, a little variation, but it's stability. Nothing.
What does that tell us? I mean, and then there was a change?
Yeah.
At that?
Yeah, but actually what's happening, see, my initial work was in these rocks, but just one group of trilobites. And I wasn't looking at the rest of the fauna. Now we're looking at the rest of the fauna, we're finding every species is doing virtually the same thing. There's almost none of this evolutionary stasis. But it's on an ecological level. Yeah. And what it really means is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And things are stable, and as long as the habitats will change. One thing that was always assumed was that when the environment changes, for instance, when the glaciers come down, it gets cold and so forth, and the glaciers start migrating further south, that the organisms that are able to adjust to this by evolving, for instance, long coats of hair and so forth, will do so, and they will survive. The alternative will be extinction. And now we know. Anybody who feeds birds around here knows that mockingbirds and tufted titmice and cardinals and so forth, which are so common around here, 100 years ago, they weren't found here. The climate's been warming up regularly, whether it's global warming, human-caused, or a combination of some more natural event or whatever that's doing it. And what we're seeing is a migration north of birds and plants and mammals and so forth. And what happens is that when you change the environment, particularly temperature, you get organisms, species tracking that.
Following.
So,
right.
So instead of evolution doing the job and making them adjust to the new conditions where they are right now, they switch their geographic. But even trees move because trees send out seeds every day.
Yeah, they have a certain climax vegetation that they can exhibit. But this long period.
So that gives you stability, even in the face of.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
As long as you can recognize suitable habitat, the habitat that you're already adapted to, you're not going to evolve and you're not going to go extinct.
So that would seem to indicate that a species, once it's there, given it'll be for a long time.
That's right.
And then
the average duration, we were saying in the 70s, the average duration of a marine species seems to be 5 to 10 million years. And with examples, plenty of examples where it seems to even be longer.
Okay, and I wonder if we have any, because the species have come and died, they're coming off now and that sort of thing. But this punctuated equilibrium, and then
the other side of the story.
All of a sudden there will be a proliferation of new, or what does that mean exactly?
Well, the isolated example I was looking at showed that new species tend to appear relatively rapidly without a great deal of change from the parental species, and if they get established, then they'll live on side by side. So what I was doing basically was borrowing from a different aspect of contemporary evolutionary biological theory, which is called speciation theory. It's developed by the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky at Columbia and Ernst Mayr at the American Museum of Natural History. Those are the two leading people who in the late 30s, early 40s. And speciation is a matter of fragmentation of reproductive communities. So you get two where once you just had one.
So you're going to need geographical isolation.
You need geographical isolation usually to break up, that's the reproductive continuity that's initially there. So when I mapped out what was going on with my trilobites, I saw precisely that. I saw this sort of what they call peripheral isolates, these isolated populations out on the periphery of a species range. Getting established and then getting a sort of an ecological toehold, if you will, and then persisting, and then I had two species where we started off with one living. One of them, the primitive one, was living out in the Midwest in slightly different environmental conditions, what is now the American Midwest, and it was a limestone coral reef kind of a sea, and then the other one lived, the descendant one was living in the Appalachians. It was what is now the Appalachians, muddy basins. It's kind of a different ecological setting. And then what happened was the seas withdrew from the continental interior, so the other thing went extinct. And once the seas came back to the continental interior, the descendant species then spread in. So it's a geographic and ecological story on top of this evolutionary.
And that gave you a view in terms of the overall view of evolution itself and a theory of the evolution which would be applicable to evolution as a process.
Right. It's speciation coupled with a tremendous conservatism, stability of species once they're there. That was the initial core idea. But now we're finding out that it's not just isolated lineages that are showing this, but it's entire ecosystems that are doing this. And now the model that we have is it starts to talk about the interplay between extinction on the one hand and evolution on the other. This Hamilton fauna they keep talking about, this 6 or 7 million years, utter stability of 300 different species in there. They persist. Some of them drop out before they get to the end, but most of them get to the end, and then there's a turnover, rapid turnover. We don't even know what the environmental event back then was, but something happened. Whether it was climate or what, I really don't know. And only about 20% of the species get through.
All right.
And some others come in from different regions.
Yeah, we've had periods, catastrophe periods or something of that sort in the evolutionary pattern.
That's right. So
but
far,
a number of those that have marked.
Thank God that so far something.
We wouldn't be here if that had been, right?
Yeah, the worst one was 245 million years ago when
dinosaurs.
We lost. No, that was prior to the dinosaurs. The end of the Permian, when we lost some. The most extreme estimate, might not be right, is 96% of the species on the face of the Earth.
Pretty close call there, huh?
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
But the amazing side, the flip side of that is that you can reproliferate life, and all the ecosystems and all the fantastic diversity that we have right now comes out of that 4% genetic bottleneck.
So we came within 4% of losing life on this planet, which is an extremely delicate thing. Their life evolved, and again, we haven't gotten into it. And we do want to get into Louis Leakey and human evolution, Homo sapien, and so forth, But the fact that life here appears, and we were talking off camera a little bit, that it's such an incredible thing. I mean, the life
It's amazing.
system. I mean, the Earth system and the ecosystems on the Earth is so amazing, and particularly in terms of the universe and whether or not we can so easily, like Carl Sagan and others, say that there are other forms in the universe.
Yeah, right.
But that's the sort of precious liaison we have, that life form, and we came within 4% of losing it.
That's the extreme estimate, but still.
That's the extreme estimate that we have from the fossil record.
Right,
the most,
right. It might have been not
harrowing.
quite. It might have been only. 80%.
Then there was the time when the dinosaurs and the mammals.
That was 65 million
65
years
million.
ago. So that whatever the difference between that was the last great mass. We're in the mass extinction event right now.
We're in a mass extinction.
We are,
event
but
now.
the last one prior to that was 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs finally.
How many of the
succumbed.
mass extinctions can you read in the fossil record?
Well, actually, if you look at any chart of geological time, which all beginning geology students have to look at, those divisions are all based on a rock record of extinctions.
I see. Okay.
They're all turnovers.
So how many have we got
living
then?
things. Global ones 5. Some people would say 6, but now it's popular to say that the one we're in right now is the 6th extinction.
The 6th extinction.
Richard Leakey's latest book is called The 6th Extinction.
It is,
and
okay.
And it's referring to, not to plug Richard's book here, but
Well, why not? You know, I mean, we might as well let people read things like paleontology instead of all that other kinds of stuff. And it is an incredibly exciting event. Right. So let's begin to move along toward getting up toward our own species and so forth. We're moving along, and we had the dinosaurs. You say 65.
Well, actually, one good point about that is that the mammals, we're mammals, right?
Yes.
And primates are mammals. We're primates. We originated as mammals at the same time the dinosaurs did, way back in the Triassic, but for reasons which are very unclear. It was the dinosaurs that proliferated and took all the jobs, if you want to think very simplistically, all the ecological niches.
150 million or something like that years ago? Or
we're talking about 220 million years
220.
ago.
And we would have been contained in some small...
Well, we were a little, what Al Romer used to be at Harvard, famous, and a lot of the MDs in New York read Romer's comparative anatomy book when they went to medical school.
Yeah.
He called the mammals of the Mesozoic the rats of the Mesozoic. There was some diversification, but ecologically speaking, they were all omnivorous pretty much. They ate anything.
Were they mammalian, or they
were
way to
mammals.
mammalian? They were on their way to mammalian.
Primitive mammals. They were all no bigger than this, and
Mm-hmm.
they were probably all nocturnal. And another phrase I like, maybe it's Steve Gould phrase, I don't know. They were living in the interstices of the dinosaurs' world.
Yeah, that's right.
See, so the dinosaurs had all the big jobs.
Yeah.
They were the big herbivores, the small herbivores, the big carnivores, the scavengers. The dinosaurs had all those jobs. And the collateral kin were the flying reptiles and various different other groups that were aquatic.
And we were scurrying
the
around.
mammals were just doing, nothing much.
Scurrying around,
anything.
picking up the crumbs.
Exactly, that kind of thing. And this went on for about, 150 million years, whatever the numbers are.
Yeah.
And the dinosaurs had some crises. There was a big extinction event at the end of the Triassic, but they managed to get through, and then they reproliferated, took up, evolved into all these other niches, the same niches, and the mammals remained obscure. And it wasn't until the end of the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs, who were already dwindling, finally the terrestrial ones became extinct because birds are sort of
descendants of, aren't
they
they?
are basically dinosaurs, but that's the sort of an exception to this. The terrestrial dinosaurs finally became extinct, and after a lag of, I guess it's 3 or 4 million years, mammals, all of a sudden, they finally had an opportunity, and I think it's literally the case.
60 million years ago?
65 million years ago. Finally, they didn't have that competition out there. So all of a sudden, the mammals become big, herbivorous things, and large carnivores and so forth. And they basically inherited the earth.
And those are our ancestors. Yeah, right. And then we're going along. And then I wonder, this is so interesting. We sit and talk for hours and hours easily and everything. But I wonder we're going to move along. In fact, your book, a great deal has to do with culture and so forth.
Sure.
We better move along a little bit. And coming up, and getting up to the understandings of, let's say, the evolution of what is now our species, Homo sapiens sapien, right? We go and we begin to understand from Louis Leakey's work and other kinds of Olduvai and that kind of thing, that Australopithecine, or the line that was to lead up to the hominoids and so forth. We begin to get a clear understanding, agreement on that now. Raymond Dart and his work and that kind of thing. And, we had Peking man, we had Java man, we had Neanderthal and that kind of thing. But we begin to get a clear idea now that we can begin to differentiate the line that leads to Homo sapiens
I
sapien.
think so.
Yeah, okay.
There's no more contentious a bunch of people than paleoanthropologists.
Really?
And it used to be.
Really? I'm not sure. There's some pretty contentious people in this world, but go ahead.
Well,
if you say so.
And it used to be true that there were more more paleoanthropologists than there were bones. But thanks to their leak.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thanks to the leakies, and you have to remember, I'm not a paleoanthropologist.
I understand.
Myself.
No, but your book has a great deal.
Yeah, I do,
that.
and I rely a great deal. I've written about it, and I've been to these places, and I rely a great deal on the sagacity of my good colleague up at the American Museum, Ian Tattersall, who just completed this Hall of Human Biology and Evolution, and so a lot of his interpretations.
That's what a place to be.
Yeah,
it's a great place to be.
I recommend that hall.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But fill us in a little bit.
Yes,
also Piscine, or where do we begin? Where do we begin to understand the hominoid? And we're out of Africa, right? I mean, is this a theory now that we begin to understand and agree upon that the human evolution comes out of Africa?
Yeah, but we've been out of Africa several times, so it's not as easy.
Tell us the exciting story.
I just want to say there is more grounds and more room for consensus now. So there is a story emerging, which I think is quite defensible.
And your book has a great deal to do with it.
Yeah, and what I try to do in there is to give an ecological interpretation of this as well as just a sort of a historical litany. Because the whole point of the book is to say, where are we right now, and where are we going? Well, the way you judge where you're going is to take a look at where you come from.
Right,
and the story that I'm telling basically is the over the years, now I'm talking about 3 million years.
All right,
basically,
3 million. All right.
You see the juxtaposition of culture over biological solutions to problems of making a living. And what I mean by biological solution is an adaptation. If you're a fish swimming around and you have sharp teeth to eat other fish, that's an adaptation, behavioral and anatomical adaptation to allow you to hunt particular kinds of prey.
Or the metaphor might be mankind in Eden or something. Yeah. So that kind of metaphor, you know. Right. Yeah, right, okay.
All right, so we come out of that kind of a background. We're animals, and living inside local ecosystems all along. But what you see is the juxtaposition of culture and the gradual, I would say, hegemony, thank you.
That's all right. That's a political term. Yeah.
Which we now have of culture developed. You can see piecemeal the way culture comes to override a purely biological approach that our species,
tool making, fire, some of these things that we begin to interpret.
So the story, I pick up the story. I don't even go back all the way to Lucy and tell that story particularly, but I might just say very quickly, it's environmentally driven. 5 million years ago, the Mediterranean dried up, which I think is a wonderful story in itself, which we probably shouldn't get into. But there was a cold snap. There was a global cold snap. And that made things drier in the Mediterranean basin. There happened to be a juxtaposition of Gibraltar closed. And so right now...
Dried up, as I understand. The Mediterranean basin dried up?
Yeah, a mile deep. It's incredible. And that's because there's an awful lot of evaporation even right now going on in the Mediterranean and the Nile and the Danube and the Rhone, 3 major rivers that dump into it, are not enough, and rainfall is insufficient to keep, even right now, that water in the Mediterranean. So most of the water comes in from the Atlantic. That's what happens. And then when that closed off, that's the whole thing dried up. Anyway, there's a great faunal interchange. The first antelopes, which we associate with Africa, but actually antelopes evolved in Eurasia someplace. They got down into Africa at that point. And there was a partial growth of savanna-like conditions, and the woodlands and tropical rainforests of eastern Africa began to recede to some extent. This is the time where, just about the time when Australopithecus afarensis, named after the site in Ethiopia where Lucy was Don Johanson and his crew found Lucy. Okay, so
we go back to these early.
We have a cold snap, and we see a reflection of this in the fossil record already. It's it's a complex pattern. Partly it's ecological migrations of species into new territories because the basic environment has changed, and also there's an evolutionary response. But this is kind of dim. So I like to pick the story up at 3 million years ago. I was just in Sterkfontein Caves in South Africa in September. And they're beginning to tell the same story there that's has been told about East Africa for some years now. And the story is that about 3 million years ago, there was a species best known from the South Africa, Dart's thing.
Yeah, Raymond Dart. Yeah.
Australopithecus africanus.
Right.
Stood about 4 feet tall, weighed about 85, 90 pounds, I guess. Fully bipedal because the ancestors were already up and walking. That was the footprints that Mary Leakey found. Probably omnivorous, probably doing a little bit of scavenging, eating certainly vegetation as well, living in small bands in local ecosystems. Probably without tools. Raymond Dart, who's, as you say, was the first initial discoverer of this particular species, thought they had a complex culture, but that's been more or less shot down. He thought they had called it an osteodontocheratic culture, bone, tooth, and horn. The penchant for Greek words like that.
Yeah. Like Ardrey could pick up on.
Yeah, and Ardrey did.
Right. Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, this is the
naked ape.
The naked ape was the killer ape, and this was this species. Now it's known to have been much more a victim. You find the bones and the skulls and so forth in the caves. Leopards.
Yes.
Now black eagles, apparently.
Amazing how those teeth marks matched the cranium, right? Yes, right.
The skull,
yeah, we were probably hunted a good deal of the time.
Yeah,
the ancestors.
absolutely.
Yeah. But in any case,
this species is living there in local ecosystems, and 2.5 million years ago, I think there was a really important event. It was a climatic event. It was essentially the kickoff to the ice age that we're in, but there's no evidence as yet in the northern continents for the actual growth of a glacier. You don't see that until about 1.5 million years ago, 1.6 million years ago. But 2.5 million years ago, there was a global cooling event, a snap, maybe 10 degrees, 15 degrees centigrade average.
Worldwide?
Worldwide.
Huge.
Over 100 or 200,000 year period.
Yeah.
This had an enormous effect on the African ecosystems.
Which does underspell how closely those gradients are written, isn't it, in terms of which life evolves. But
okay. So what happens?
That's a whole other issue, right? Yeah.
So Africanus disappears, and right on the other side of this 2.5 million year old line, you get you get a complete reworking of the African ecosystem. So a lot of species disappear, a lot of new ones appear. Some of that is extinction and evolution on the other side.
Yeah.
Some of it seems to be migrating in and out, like I keep describing when the environments change. What happened in this instance was you got the widespread appearance of grasslands and savanna conditions, really sort of like old Serengeti kind of conditions now, started to take over eastern and southern Africa. So ecological is a very, very different situation. So you get migration in and out of species, but also the true extinction of some species and the evolution of others, probably through fragmentation of habitat, the speciation mechanism that we were talking about just briefly before.
Yeah.
Well, in our lineage, Australopithecus africanus becomes extinct. Right about then.
And so we pick up Homo habilis? Or
you get Homo habilis. You get two
habilis,
things. You get two things. You get this sort of side shoot, which is called Paranthropus robustus. Used to be called Australopithecus robustus. Superficially more gorilla-like. Basically the same kind of brain size. Still upright bipedal creature, but it's got a massive skull. And what it was it was eating. It was an obligate. Herbivore, was eating tubers and nuts and so forth, had massive musculature on the side of the head to run this big jaw apparatus, huge teeth.
Yeah, they need to grind up.
And so they're specialists. They're fascinating, but they're a sideline.
It's interesting. We were following on a generalist pattern, do you think?
We are generalists.
Yeah, we are generalists, and we should remember that, right?
Ecologically, we're quite generalized. These were specialists, and I'll just one more word about them. Over a course of about 1 million years, there's 5 at least that they count now, different species of these creatures. And so like a lot of specialists in the fossil record show very rapid rates of evolution and very high rates of extinction. Because in a sense you're putting all your that's exactly it, you know, and you're at risk. And so you're a lot less likely to survive even minor environmental perturbations.
So we're following up the line of Homo habilis.
No, I haven't gotten there yet. This is Paranthropus. Okay.
We better get to Homo sapiens sapiens before the end of the show.
Where are we?
We're at Homo habilis.
Yeah, no, I know where we are. But we have time, right?
Yeah. Well, we've got about 20 minutes.
There you go. You can see I like to talk about
I do, too. That's time is our enemy.
All right, the neat thing is that stone tools show up in 2.5 million years.
Okay.
And that means, it was obvious that some of our predecessors had wood tools that don't make it into the fossil record.
Probably.
But these are thrilling because you start finding these crude choppers, these so-called Oldowan choppers. And there's the first sort of material evidence you can point to, say, bing, culture is there, culture is beginning to inform the lives of these
Exactly,
creatures.
and that's the theme of your book, nature
That's right.
and culture.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's
Toolmakers.
really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
But they evolved in response to a climatic event. And it's not the last time that this actually happens. Getting close to the end of where climate, we were like other species then, though. We were victims of extinction. Climatically induced episodes would drive some of our ancestors extinct. It would cause the evolutionary or the ecological conditions that would drive the evolution of other species in our lineage, just like the rest of the species in the ecosystems.
Yeah, and
culture hadn't really taken on it, but we
were much more susceptible to the local ecosystem along all other species.
And so you see Homo habilis,
and
the only other thing about it that I should say is that the species had a much larger brain. You see a 750 cubic centimeter type, which is still only about half what we have, but nonetheless it was a distinct, marked advance. The story gets a little murky. Nobody knows for sure what happened to Homo habilis, so let's skip ahead. There were migrations
out of Africa by these?
No.
No, okay. This is all going on in Africa.
Yeah, this is all Africa.
Africa's the home of us all.
1.6 million years ago, you get the appearance of a thing called Homo erectus. Now, there's some disagreement on how to name these things. I don't think we have to get involved with that. And the latest findings that came out after my book came out, but thank God I have a footnote in here alluding to this.
Oh, thank goodness. You covered yourself.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
There's some sense now that the earliest hominid creatures, our ancestors out of Africa, were about 1.7 million years ago, which is astonishing.
And what would they be classified?
Well, these were these early Homo erectus. And that's right about at the time that you get the first major glaciation. We've had 4 major bouts of glaciation in the last 1.6 million years. So that's remarkable that these creatures are out there. In many ways, I like that story. That's still being debated, whether those dates are accurate and so forth. The story I'm telling in here, I'll stick to it right now for simplicity, is that this Homo erectus appeared in Africa 1.6, 1.7 million years ago, just about the time that there was another global cooling snap. These creatures stood about our height. They had brains around 1,000 cubic centimeters.
Getting up there.
They had fire. They had more sophisticated tools.
Would these be Peking, Java, or these kind of things?
Peking and Java are the last manifestations.
Would be Homo sapien archaic or
something? No, they're Homo erectus.
Homo erectus,
in fact, amongst the earliest ones found were those ones. But they're at the tail end of this history. And as I say, the history is being rewritten a little bit from the story that I'm telling you. It was a remarkably successful species. This group, whatever they're going to end up being called, lasted for 1.3 million years.
Holy mackerel, that is a long time.
It didn't change. Now, the old story, the story that I'm emphasizing in here.
Punctuated Equilibria.
Yeah, there you go. That's the best example from our own past. This species, it looked like, up until very, very recently, last month, didn't get out of Africa until about 0.9, just under 1 million years ago, in the teeth of the second glacial advance.
Tough suckers.
Yeah. So the story that I tell in here about that is that this is incredible because they had fire, and obviously it's the first time you can see a species actually expanding its ecological
in the teeth of that.
In the teeth of that, exactly. I think it's incredible.
That's a lot of culture there.
And whatever, now it turns out that they probably went out there in the teeth of the first glacial event, not the second one. So the story, the sort of the moral of the story is the same, but it's even more remarkable as it was. But it's unusual to see a species expanding its range like that, particularly in the face of environmental, the very kind of event that used to drive our species and their ancestral species and other species extinct and prompting maybe the evolution of others. Now they're embracing. Why? Because they have fire and they have this social organization. They're still living as parts of local ecosystems. They're still making their living off the land, of course.
Well, isn't it true to say we were living part of the local ecosystem until maybe agriculture or
that's what I'm saying.
Really took hold.
That's what I'm saying in the book. And of course, there are still some remnant hunter-gatherer groups who are still... Not many, and none of them are unaffected by post-agricultural culture.
Right. All right, but the Homo erectus, and then Homo, where do we fit in? Is there Homo sapien archaic, or is that an outdated group or notion, and Homo sapien sapien? And we want to get up to this genetic stuff. If you could mention that. Wilson's work out of Berkeley and that kind of thing, where that fits in, and try to bring us up to the modern. You know?
All right, so skipping from a
couple 100 million years or so.
1.6 million years. Yeah, where do we come from?
Yeah.
There's two
That seems to be our lineage. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens archaic?
Well, that's...
Or am I using a wrong term?
Yeah, those terms are not being used anymore. The story that's emerging, well, there's really two conflicting points of view right now. Milford Wolpoff of the University of Michigan would be the main spokesperson.
Thinks Neanderthals right in the gene pool. Right?
Exactly, right. The idea, if you put a hat and a coat on a Neanderthal, stick him on a New York City subway, as long as he kept his mouth shut. I was just reading in the Times. He would make it through just fine. The idea there would be that we spread around the world as Homo erectus and then went towards Homo sapiens independently in each of several different areas, Africa itself, Europe, through perhaps the Neanderthals, and Asia, so that the major races of modern humanity can be traced directly going back 1.5 million years. Now, I might have
somebody Springer or something, or
well, Chris Stringer has he champions the idea that I champion, which I'm not articulating right now. But this, to my mind, is very bad biology, because it's one where you can enforce an interpretation of the fossil record. You can force that interpretation on the facts of the fossil record, I suppose. I think you really have to strain at it increasingly now. But there's no other example like this in the history of life, where a species will evolve, spread out over the globe, will evolve in concert in this gradual manner. That's the whole thing that punctuated Equilibria
I understand,
teaches us.
Now, this other...
So the other interpretation is that we were a separate species.
Wilson, go ahead.
Yeah, and there's two lines of evidence to support this. That we, as a separate species, Homo sapiens sapiens.
Yes, that's our species.
The phrase that we use now is anatomically modern humans. Appeared in Africa. I think the oldest fossils are about 120,000 years old.
And does this DNA
the DNA business, the mitochondrial DNA, the whole Eve business, we only get our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers.
Yes,
so the Eve was more than just a good public relations coup. It was actually sort of an appropriate...
biologically based,
very often in the history of the last 20 years, the biochemical data and interpretations have not agreed with the fossil record. And so there's been a lot of bitterness. Alan Wilson, that you mentioned, was the champion of this Eve hypothesis. He's unfortunately dead now.
Yes, he died.
Yeah. Always at war with paleontologists, you know, and always championing the virtues of molecules over fossils.
Well, that's a new thing that came along. Well, who would? And paleontologists are looking at fossil records, and here comes this new thing out of genetics.
Exactly.
And so these scientists,
and we're living in a gene-based culture. We're living.
Well, we have the DNA now. We have superstring theory. We have new understandings and so forth. But are they beginning to come together on that now?
My point about this
are they beginning to come together? These scientists, these specialists, and so forth.
Well, it's a happy coincidence that he was saying Eve was maybe 250,000 years old.
Depends on 200,000, but
200,000. I've seen up to 250, but then sometimes you see 150, 200. It depends on who you're reading and so forth.
Yeah, right, okay.
Saying that the common ancestor of all of us, if you look at the mitochondrial DNA, was an African woman who lived 150 to 175,000 years ago, whatever the figures are. Now, there's a lot of criticism by geneticists of that particular study. All I want to say is that it does happen to agree fairly well with what the fossil record shows, which is in southern Africa, about 120,000 years ago, you get at several sites anatomically modern humans, and these are by all odds the oldest anatomically modern humans. 90,000 years ago, our species was present in the Mideast, in present-day Israel. 40,000. Then when we started the diaspora, started going around the world.
Diaspora out of South Africa.
Out of Africa.
We're all out of Africa.
We're all out of Africa.
We're
all Africans.
We're all Africans, essentially. Yeah, right. Yeah. And the differences, species, the racial differences, and so forth, are built within the relatively small differences are built within this period of 200,000 years.
Well, I would say
from geographical isolation.
Less than 100,000.
Less than 100,000 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that conforms with genetic understanding of processes and change and so forth as all, because it's superficial stuff.
That's the way I read it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So, all right, so we spread around the world, and everywhere we went, we started driving species extinct because we were like a bull in a china shop. It's really
we were so successful.
Very successful.
By the utilization of culture, by and large, not because of you know, not so much because of this ecosystem, you know, the process of biological evolution, but is this cultural evolution,
right.
and the extension of consciousness and technology,
you know,
and
right.
so forth. And that's what your theme is about: culture and you know, nature coexist.
Exactly. You know, I was just standing on the African savannah in September, and you know, and you wonder why you basically have a Pleistocene zoo. I say zoo there, and it's, of course, more than that. But how did that survive, and everything else got bumped off? All the big mammals elsewhere. The answer is that we evolved there, and it's remarkable. You drive up to these animals in a jeep; they don't pay any attention.
Yeah.
You appear a two-legged person on the savannah, they melt away. Even the lions, they'll melt away. They just know that we're the top predator there. And you can imagine, a friend of mine, Joel Craycraft, said, geez, you know, you realize when we spread around the globe, the large mammals didn't know we were coming. They didn't know about us.
Yeah, I know. They didn't.
And we were able to basically cause systematic destruction.
And we have in a sort of unique way. There's no I don't know whether the dinosaurs were that prevalent as we are now, but we're now 2.7 and growing fast. 5.7 billion. 5.7 billion. And that's a result of our cultural success, and we can't continue. We'll be SRO in elephants if we're not careful.
In ourselves. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
that's what your book is about.
Well, the book is all about basically the real thing was we really took over when we invented agriculture.
10,000 years ago.
10,000 years ago, independently in several different places. That took off the lid. We stepped out. We stopped living inside a local ecosystem. So there was no longer control on our human population.
Global economics.
That's right. So what we have now is the estimates are anywhere between 1 and 5 million people 10,000 years ago, and it's 5.
Only.
Yeah.
How much again?
1 to 5. One estimate says 10, no more, million people on the planet 10,000 years ago.
Wow.
And it's 5.7 billion now. The population has doubled since I was born in 1943.
Got to be brought under control.
That's right. That's because we stepped outside of the local ecosystem. That lid was taken off the control of the population.
Right. Okay, yeah. Right. Well, I'll tell you, it's an exciting story. We could just go talk for hours, 15, 20, 30 hours. There's no end to it because the story is inherently incredibly interesting. We've only been able to touch the surface go down so many of these little trains or, avenues we could have gone down and so forth. But I just want to let people know about the book again, if you don't mind. Great. Dominion is Henry Holt, right? Dominion. It's been our pleasure to present a brief summary of the many things that go on in the minds of our guest, who is Niles Eldredge, again, who is at the Dr. Niles Eldredge, who's at the American Museum of Natural History. He's written this extremely interesting book. Again, Dominion: Can Nature and Culture Coexist? Happy to have been able to bring you those perceptions, and I thank you very much, Niles, for coming in. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been a lot of fun.
And we on Conversations, invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next time. But that's it for this program. We'd like to wish you the best of the holiday season, this 1995-96 season, and to again invite you to tune back. We'll be coming back again next week. Niles, once again, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thanks, Al.
Until next time. Oh God, there's too much to go into. But
well,
really an interesting story.
You kept me going. I mean, otherwise I would have been still in the Paleozoic.
Well, it's easy because it's so damned interesting. Yeah. That's the hell of it, isn't it? Well, it's a nice hell of it to have, though, because it's all interesting stuff. So. And we'll put this together and let you know. I'll be in touch with you, about when it'll be. It'll be over the next couple of weeks or so, and that kind of thing. And you should just hold on for a second. I think they're still just running. They're running a couple of things here. So I hope maybe you can get over to the party. I hope maybe if you can get over to the party. I think there'll be a lot of interesting people there.
I'll have to check and see what's happening.
Yeah, I know. I understand. But so this is. Sometime you're up there, I work up there every time. Maybe I can come in and see you sometime.
Do that.
Yeah,
I'm usually,
I
stay home and write on Tuesdays and Thursdays whenever I can do that.
So. Yeah. You got another book in the works?
Yeah.
What's it on?
Well, actually, I want to just expand all of this and talk about the shape.
I really enjoyed reading. I've read the whole book. I really enjoyed it, and it really is good. I like this. Well, I like this sort of stuff. It's such an interesting. It's just inherently interesting.
Well, I
got books stacked up all over. There's too many interesting things.